Well, you asked for it, so why not? Along with everybody else here on BookTube, I thought I would get in with my top 10 reads of 2020. Frankly, no one cares about what kind of books that you loved this past year. If you really want to get those BookTube views, you need to talk about the books you hated, hurl invectives at so-so books, that authors that had the temerity to disappoint you. And if you are really lucky, perhaps that author will slide into your DMs and helpfully explain that perhaps you had misinterpreted what they were going for, and maybe you wouldn't want to consider your starred reviewed. I don't know what it is about this year, but everyone is offering up hot takes on their hated books. But here, it's nothing but rainbow sprinkles and unicorn farts as I list out my favorite reads of this year. So, if you're not digging out from under a pile of Christmas reads that you've been gifted, getting caught up on your 2020 best of lists, or resolving this year like you do every year to read through your frickin' TBR pile, here are a couple more reads to add to that list. Now, this top 10 list changes depending on the day of the week, so this is what I loved today. And in no particular order, let's get started. This is How You Lose the Time War. This is a short sci-fi novella released in 2019, and in that year won all the awards. The Hugo, the Nebula, the Locust, the Ray Bradbury Award. And it's the story about two warring, multidimensional factions in a time war. You have Red, who's part of a post-singularity technocratic future, as well as Blue, who is part of a verdant fairy green utopia. And so these two are the best of their respective factions, and they start out with this sort of begrudging respect for each other that slowly blossoms into something more. Time-traveling love stories are just ridiculously hard to land because you need to establish a beginning, a middle, and an end. And I have to admit, they nailed it, and halfway through I started entertaining some wild theories about what was going on, which I won't get into because of spoilers. Now, this was co-written two authors, Max Gladstone, who not for nothing spent quite a lot of time translating ancient Chinese poetry, as well as Amal Al-Mutar, who is a Canadian poet and sci-fi writer. One would write the circumstance in which the letter arrived, and the other would write the contents of the letter, and they would switch back and forth between each other in the chapters. Now, this was also interesting in that this was the first book we read as part of our office book club. What was interesting is this was a polarizing read. Half of the people hated it, didn't even finish it. The other half, the empathetic, erudite, literary types amongst our midst, loved this book. And I think part of it has to do with the fact that if you're obsessed with this multidimensional time war, why it's going on, what's the end goal, all of that, then you can sort of be disappointed because I think that's just the window dressing to the story. Really what this is a queer epistolatory romance, and it is just the letter writing between the two of them, and everything else around that is just fun and interesting. I mean, you have all of time to play with, and you also have to create a condition where it's not obvious where the letter is, and so you have incidents where it is the sound of the wind chimes coded to release the contents of the letter, or embedded in the rings of a tree that have been felled. Anyway, it really is just fantastically done love story. Well worth checking out. Nupaming is from Toronto-based House of Anansi Press, and author Leanne Simpson is a Anishinaabe scholar, writer, artist, and musician. Nupaming is Anishinaabe-Moan for In the Bush, and the book itself is a response to Susanna Moody's 1852 memoir called Roughing It in the Bush, recounting her time in Truro Township, which is just about 2 hours northeast of where I live. Now, Nupaming, I consider it something like American Gods, where the indigenous gods are walking amongst us, walking on their ancestral lands that have been buried under 1 million tons of concrete, steel, high-rises, and highways. And they're just trying to get by, looking for types to go on sale at Canadian Tire, buying rotting fruits and vegetables at the discount aisle in the grocery store, hoarding knickknacks, and struggling with sobriety. Nupaming isn't written for me. It doesn't make concessions for my worldview, and it is just confident, brash, and completely beautiful. If you are looking for some Canadian Indigenous reads, I cannot recommend this book highly enough. Dune by Frank Herbert. I mean, come on, this is some original OG sci-fi shit. I remember absolutely loving this book as a kid. I can still smell the musty pages of the mass market paperback and how I remember equating that to Iraqi spice. And with the imminent Denis Villeneuve movie, it seemed like a good time for a reread. Certainly not original thought. BookTube was littered with people doing read-alongs and rereads this past year. And I mean, Denis Villeneuve, he warrants the reread. He has proven himself able to film the unfilmable, what with The Arrival and Blade Runner 2049. And so there was still a bit of trepidation diving in. I mean, we're not talking years since I last read this. It's decades. I mean, and this was a chunker of a novel, but honestly, I needn't have worried. I absolutely loved this reread. I was totally all in for the political intrigue, the backstabbing, the plot inside of plots, the pseudo-religiosity of the Bene Gesserit, the prophecy of the Muad'Dib. I mean, totally all in. Second half, a little slower. I wasn't so much into all the sort of future prophecies and the lack of clarity in those visions, and I get it. It's setting up the following books, and I hear the first trilogy is really good, well worth checking out, but I don't know if I'm completely sold. That might be a project for next holiday season. But in the meantime, Dune, just a corker of a read. Totally loved my experience rereading it this year. Ducks Newburyport. I have a hard time believing this was a 2020 read. I mean, I myself, like probably a lot of you, 2020 has been the longest 18 years of my life. But this was one of those books that was just in my collective consciousness. I just knew inevitably that I was going to be reading this thing, even though this was an absolute monster of a book. It weighs in at over 1,000 pages. According to Goodreads, it's the single longest book that I read last year. And really, all it is a stream of consciousness of an Ohio housewife who's going off on all these mental tangents, thinking about things like, I don't know, the contents of her freezer, product brand names, Fatbergs, tardigrades, Little House on the Prairie, The Abominable Snowman, Open Carry Guys, and it's just all the background noise of living in America post-2016. I mean, this is almost like a museum piece in literary form. It is a time capsule of this particular moment in time, and it is a credit to Lucy Ellman that she is able to cohere all these divergent thoughts into a single book. Yes, over 1,000 pages, but still, just an incredible piece of work. I really did enjoy this experience. At the other end of the spectrum is Run Me to Earth. I don't know how Paul Yoon does it, but this is such a beautiful, incredibly beautiful read. There are moments in there, it is like watching a movie with wide open shots evoking tons of space, quiet moments where you can hear the sound of rain dripping in the background and the quiet breathing of the main character. We're following the story of 3 orphans working out of an abandoned farmhouse turned into a makeshift hospital in Laos. Laos is a country the size of Utah that for 9 years had the equivalent of a bomb dropped on it every 8 minutes. 2 million tons of ordnance, more bombs dropped on it than the entirety of World War II, and 30% of them are still unexploded. And in this environment, the kids are driving around on motorbikes, picking up supplies and patients. And it's filled with these moments of quiet that make the violence that occurs occasionally just explode off of the page. This book spans decades, follows the 3 kids as they travel around the world. And again, I don't know how he does it, but even now, months after having read it, I can still picture moments clearly in my head. He just, with a few words on the page, just evokes this beautiful scenery. It's as if I'd seen the movie of this book. Anyway, an incredible, incredible read. Such a fun age. You know what? I'm always going to be grateful for this particular book from Kylie Reid because this is the book that pushed me out of my pandemic reading slump. Also clear, Kylie Reid knows kids, probably in large part to the fact that she was a nanny for 6 years taking care of rich Manhattanite children. Anyway, it shows in her portrayal of Briar, who is a weird, anxious, thoughtful little kid that loves the smell of tea bags. Is clearly someone that Amira dearly loves. Amira is our protagonist. She's a 25-year-old black woman just trying to figure her stuff out. She gets called away from the club to take care of Briar as the family deals with a bit of an emergency. So she takes Briar down to the upscale grocery store down the road, and things quickly escalate from there. New York Karen inevitably shows up, accuses Amira of kidnapping this white child, and of course it builds from there. It's all captured on cell phone video camera, and it does eventually get resolved, but it becomes the instigating moment of this story. And from there, Kylie Reid is just having a ton of fun exploring ideas of fetishization, microaggression, virtue signaling, respectability, politics, influencer culture, allyship, armchair activism, all of it. But it's done not with a heavy hand. Like, it's light, it's fun. It's clear she is skewering the well-meaning white liberal that's become all too familiar. And this was just such an entertaining and fun read. The Biggest Bluff. Maria Konnikova has a PhD in psychology and is a regular contributor to the New York Times. So it seems a little odd for someone who has never played poker in her life to decide to learn to eventually compete in the World Series of Poker. Now, this journey Ended up taking a little longer than she expected, but along the way, she earned nearly $250,000 in poker winnings. Now, this isn't a poker how-to book. This is a book all about learning to pay attention. Early on, Maria Konikova's poker mentor, Eric Seidel, says, less certainty, more inquiry. Question everything, stay open-minded, and adjust as needed. And that's relevant on the poker table when the board suddenly becomes flushy against your pocket aces, but it's also relevant in life, because in life there are no perfect answers. You have to make decisions based on incomplete information. And what could be more relevant at this particular moment? And fate is always just around the corner, looking to flush you down the river on what you thought was a lock hand. In poker, as in life, you can do everything right and still lose. That's just life. You need to move on. There is no such thing as bad beats. Readjust, reassess, avoid superstition, examine your biases, and avoid thinking you're owed anything. Such great advice and so timely at this particular moment. Love this read. How to Pronounce Knife. Giller Award winner Suvankam Thamongvosa is a creative writing teacher at my old alma mater, but aside from that, this short story collection just hits me where I live. It is all about the immigrant experience, the first generation immigrants struggling with the words, missing social cues, and just trying to figure out the unsaid rules of this new world, and the second generation with their keen eyes watching, paying so much attention to those unsaid rules because they don't have the benefit of generations of family that were born and raised here that just take for granted this innate knowledge of, dinner customs, holiday traditions, slang words, the unsaid rules, how you get ahead in this world, because you learn very quickly that this is not, in fact, a meritocracy, and then you often come up hard against white mediocrity that somehow wins the prize, gets the red yo-yo, the front office job, the managerial position without even trying. This is all about paying attention. This is such a finely crafted, beautifully done, and personally relevant short story collection that just completely slaps. Loved it. Fleischman in Trouble. This was my first read of 2020 back in a long ago time when World War III was trending on Twitter. Wildfires were engulfing Australia, and there was this sort of flu-like bug that was making the rounds in China. Probably nothing to worry about, right? Oh, man. Wow. Anyway, Fleischman in Trouble. We have a hand-wringing New York Jew suddenly single after his divorce, finding that New York is awash with women that want to sleep with him. Okay, how about Upper East Side doctor, played off by his wife as a slacker for not living up to his true earning potential. Totally relatable. All right, this is really the story of Toby Fleischman as told by his college friend. And she's more interested in just doing a pity party for Toby Fleischman. She's examining how her story has sort of ended with marriage. It feels like she's handed all her chips over to her husband and say, take them, I don't need them anymore. How she's been rendered invisible by domestication. And how that changes when the person that's left behind maybe is a guy. I mean, Toby Fleischman's wife has gone off to pursue her careerist ambition. She's making serious bank and has left Toby behind holding the bag, taking care of the children. Now, the traditional story, it's always the guy that goes off, leaving his marriage in flame while he pursues his careerist ambition, and he is just seen as the golden hero striving for the brass ring. But when you gender flip that, the wife is played off as a monster. She's completely vilified. Why is that? I mean, I'm surprised this book doesn't have more legs. This is book club catnip as far as I'm concerned. I enjoyed this read immensely, and I thought there was a lot going on here. But again, I get it. 2020, such an odd, crazy year. Whatever it is that you needed to do to keep reading and keep that fuzziness at bay. Maybe it's just sticking with genre, romance, sci-fi, whatever. However, you got your reading legs under you so that you could keep reading if even that was something you had space for this past year. Anyway, that is number 9 of 10. From one end of the year to the other, this was a book I read near the tail end of 2020. It is the one book that made any list of my top 10. It is my all-time favorite read of last year, my sole 5-star read of last year, Butter, Honey, Pig Bread. It is from a small independent, Canadian independent, Arsenal Pulp Press, debut novel released in the midst of a pandemic, hardly a marketing push behind it. And I only picked it up because it was part of the Giller long list. And wow, just blown away. Like I said before, this is a love letter to a time before COVID, where you could get together with an acquaintance at a quaint little coffee shop and sit and chat over the tea steeping in the cups with you, or go to an acquaintance house for an impromptu dinner and the promise of something more, to have family travel around the world, gather in the kitchen with the smell of catfish vindaloo and chocolate cake. This is prose that just makes you hungry. I loved it. So a bit of the story, Kambirananchi is an obanji. Obanji is a spirit that's tied to the spirit world that just briefly comes into the mortal realm, disappear again. It is a spirit of children that die in childbirth or soon after, but Kambirananchi is an obanji that wants to live. She decides to stay here in the mortal realm, keep those spirit voices at bay, and raise twin girls. Kahinde and Tai have been inseparable, but a traumatic event in childhood has estranged them, and it's been almost a decade. Now they're coming back to Lagos to try and mend that rift. Anyway, an incredibly beautiful story. Ekweazi is a Black, queer, Canadian author that has been added to my list of Insta-reads. I don't care what it is she puts out next, I'm going to pick it up. I want this book to be out there more. If you pick one book to read this year or to pick up for your TBR, let it be this one. I'm hoping the fact that she has been added to the shortlist for the CBC Canada Reads will introduce her to a whole new batch of readers that deserve to check this book out. It was just what I needed, and I loved it so, so much. And I hope you get a chance to check it out as well. All right, so that is my top 10 reads for 2020. Yeah, it's a little odd. I mean, the list changes all the time. And frankly, I think this rating books is almost like rating food. There's only so many ways that you can say delicious, but you can insult in so many great and creative ways. I mean, you could say there's just so much ginger in this, it's essentially a Weasley. Everybody loves that kind of stuff. Being enthusiastic about books and reads and everything else becomes a little bit more difficult. But I just couldn't do that this year. Honestly, there was a whole swath of books that I think, especially in the 2020, where it was a little fuzzy, some books I just ended up picking up, reading, and finishing it. And maybe wasn't completely as invested in them as I might have been in other years. There's been a lot of fuzzy periods this year as far as reading goes. Maybe that's the same for you as well. And I feel the fault is more my own as opposed to the author or the book itself. I don't know, maybe that's a little wishy-washy, but honestly, there's just a lot of periods of time this past year where it's just, I wasn't really in my head with the reading. It just felt like a bit of a distraction. Welcome, but not fully invested. Anyway, that is it for me this week. I hope you all have a great week of reading, and I will talk to you soon.